It's hard to coach a coach, especially someone who has personally mentored you. The reason why I got into public speaking, leading me to being a public speaking coach now, is the person we're looking at today, Brendon Burchard. I first came across Brendon when I was working on starting a business with a course mate at university. And when I first came across Brendon, I could see that he knew a lot of the strategies and the frameworks for how to approach business, online marketing. I didn't necessarily know if I liked him or not. And I remember he used to talk about this story. He said, my life changed. I was in a car crash and I learned these 3 important questions about my life. And that's kind of all that I really heard in what I saw of him initially. As many of you know, by the time I got to the end of my university time, I found out my dad had terminal cancer. He died a couple months after I graduated. In fact, a couple weeks after I graduated. And I went on this journey of trying to find out what I was going to do next. Where was I going? What did life mean now that I no longer had my dad in it? And I was still connected with Brendon's stuff. I'd subscribed to his YouTube. I was on his email mailing list. And one day an email comes through and it talked about losing my dad. And I went, what? And it turned out Brendon had lost his dad to cancer as well. And suddenly I saw this relatability and connection with Brendon that I hadn't done before. I started following him a lot more, started investing in what he was doing. I bought one of his courses. That got me some tickets to go and see him live in California. And I'm sitting there 9 months after Dad had passed, and you've probably heard me tell this story elsewhere on YouTube or other platforms. And I sit there through this 4-day seminar. And at the end, we do this final visualization process. And as I'm sitting there, I burst into tears. And I burst into tears because I found the answer that I was looking for. For the first time in my life, I truly believed that I was capable of helping people. Truly believed that I had something worthwhile to share. And I couldn't believe how much just sitting in a room and speaking to someone could have that impact, because that's the impact that Brendon had on me. Brendon changed my life. That's not hyperbole to say so. And the whole path I've gone on now of being a speaker, now ultimately being able to give back and coach other people in speaking, that all came from that one event, seeing Brendon, realizing speaking is the answer that I was looking for. Speaking is how I make my mark and impact people's lives. And what we're going to look at today is not the story of Brendon losing his dad, but actually going back to that original car accident story. Because when I was at that event in California, this is the first time I heard Brendon tell the story in full. And I realized, oh, now I see why this car accident had such a big impact on life. I'd heard an abridged version of that before. And what we're seeing here is actually a clip of Brendon telling the story in full at another live event, very similar to the one that I went to. And that's what we're going to break down today. We're going to break down, this is ultimately Brendon's origin story, Brendon's signature story. When you are speaking to an audience, the audience need to know, why should we listen to you? And how do you relate to my journey? And that's where your origin story, your signature story comes into play. Now, it doesn't have to be the same story as your audience. So I aren't going, oh, well, Brendon can only relate to people who've been in a car accident. No, it's not about the details of the story. It's about the essence of the story. And that's what we're going to look at and break down a little bit more in this session today. So it's a very tricky place for me to step into, because this is a story ultimately coming from someone who's impacted me, who's inspired me, and having to flip things around and give them that feedback. Now, first of all, there's going to be a lot of good things that I'm picking out of this, but I do also have some suggestions and improvements. And I've seen 2 tellings of this story. There was the one that I saw live, and also the one that we're seeing here on this video. And I do think they differ a little bit. And there are some things that I preferred in the version that I heard in person compared to what I saw here. but I also see that there's some additions in this version of the story that have added and improved it. So anytime you're delivering a speech, there's always going to be these iterations. There's always going to be this personal inflection and preference depending on the type of audience you happen to be speaking to and where that audience is in their time of their life, in their stage of the journey. Now, before we launch into this, my legal disclaimer, as always, this footage comes from Brendon himself and his company. I do not claim ownership to the footage. The use of this footage is for informational and educational purposes only. I can't wait to dive into this with you. It's a story that's really impacted and affected me deeply, and I'm sure when you see this as well, there's going to be a lot of great stuff that stands out to you. Let's launch in.
Or I want to be a writer, or I want to do videos, or I want to be on Facebook one day. None of that existed, and it wasn't even a dream of mine. I never even had a vision of any of this when I was a kid, right? None of this was...
Do you see that gesture there? Talking about this vision. It's this broad, expansive gesture. And this is a trademark that you'll see a lot through Brendon speaking, is he has these broad, expansive gestures. It's this really strong command of the stage. You already saw in that clip, there's a little bit of movement around the stage. He's moving to create that energy. He's also using his gestures to create that energy. When you're speaking to a big room of people, you've got to project that energy, and you've got to make sure the energy stretches from side to side and from front to back. And what we're already seeing in the opening seconds of this clip is some really dynamic, energetic movement. And here's also the thing with movement and gestures. And you've heard me say this in analysis videos before. It's not about moving and gesturing for gesture's sake. Oh, well, speaking requires lots of energy and lots of movement, so I'm just gonna walk and speak like this all the time. No, because that doesn't make sense for what's happening. Why I think this is such a great gesture, he talks about vision, and he creates this big vision. And he creates this big vision, and he also draws in the present moment into that vision. He does, I didn't see standing on this stage. So that's why this gesture is effective. It's an energetic gesture, but it's also matching what he's talking about in that moment in time. And that's the key when we talk about movement, when we talk about gestures, when we talk about body language. It's all about this idea of congruence. Is what you're doing non-verbally matching the verbals that are coming out? And what we're seeing here is this strong start with energy and gestures, but it's aligning with the words that Brendon is saying as well.
And I was miserable, and I was terrified, and I was so upset with life, and I didn't know what to do. I was 19.
Do you see the pause? I didn't know what to do. And that pause shows this uncertainty, shows this doubt. If Brendon goes, I didn't know what to do, and then I did this, it doesn't really sound like he didn't know what to do. It didn't sound like he had this moment of doubt and insecurity and uncertainty. But with that pause, we feel it. We feel this idea of this blankness, this emptiness of not knowing where he's going. And in those moments of pause, it's those moments of pause that create that connection, because it gives your audience time to process the words and in particular the emotion that has come through there. This is such a key to emotional connection. Anytime you put a pause, you're giving the time for the audience to feel and reflect on that. So when Brendon says, I didn't know what to do, and pauses, well, now the audience starts thinking about when were times that they didn't know what to do? Or even, are they sitting here at this seminar right now not knowing what they want to do? And realizing, hey, I don't know what to do right now. Neither did Brendon, but he found a way out of it. And maybe if I listen to his advice, his support, his guidance, I'll find a way out of it as well. And if I go back to my little story, just to interject here, I was one of those people, wasn't I? I was going across to California. I didn't really know who I was, what I wanted to do in life. So I'm sitting there going, I don't know exactly what I want to do. So in that moment, that is connecting with someone like me sitting in that seminar looking for those answers. And that's why the pause is so powerful, because you give you and the audience the opportunity to connect on that same wavelength.
In love with my high school sweetheart. We were that.
Great gesture here, the heart gesture. Again, talking about this idea of emotional connection. Brendon goes, in love with my high school sweetheart. We associate emotion with the heart. And although scientifically a lot of our emotions are actually processed in the head, when we talk about love, gratitude, courage, or indeed fear, anxiety, stress, a lot of that emotion, we feel it here when we talk about it. So this is a great way to anchor the audience into an emotional moment. You just put a hand or two hands on your heart. So Brendon's talking about this huge love, and it's almost like it's exploding out of his chest and he needs to hold it in. This is a really effective gesture for creating that emotional anchor with the audience. So anytime you want to drop your audience into emotion, say you've been talking about something that's quite intellectual, quite logical, maybe some data and statistics, and you want to go into the personal story or the emotional meaning behind that, a really simple way to get people out of their heads and into their hearts, just drop them in with that gesture. Show them that we're now talking about emotions, and people will start to switch into that emotional state.
So we went to school together. We signed up for classes together. We shared a U-Haul on the way to school together. We lived in the same dorm together. We walked to class. We walked to breakfast in the morning and walked to class together. I mean, we were just joined at the hip, and we were...
What did they do together? So we hear that repetition of together, 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 together. And that repetition emphasizes how symbiotic this relationship was. So this is a very simple technique. Instead of Brendon going, right, so how can I describe in this big, complex, abstract way how tight and close our relationship was, he just used the repetition of the word. We did this together, this together, this together, and starting to build up this list of repetition. And it starts to trace this journey of, wow, so they moved away together, and then they went to the same place together, and they lived together, and even when they were living there together, they would do things together. So you start to build up this narrative journey that goes, okay, this is how tight that relationship was, through the simple repetition of words. And that, of course, is going to set up, well, how much of an impact does this have later on in the story?
And then halfway through the first year of college, she discovered beer and other boys on the same night.
Beer, other boys on the same night. Brendon's using these punctuated pauses to build up this dramatic tension. And I don't actually think he's having quite the desired effect with this. This is supposed to be building into something sad. Let's listen to the next line.
And she cheated.
So this is actually supposed to be building into something sad, tough. But the audience are laughing along, so I don't think it quite had the desired effect that he wanted. I think maybe the execution of the facial expressions was still a little bit too comedic, but the delivery of the lines, beer, other boys, same night, it's building up to this dramatic tension of, oh my God, what's going to happen? And this is where I compare the version of the story that I remember hearing and the version we're seeing now. I don't remember the audience reaction being like that when we heard this part of the story. And this is actually the part of the story that I was hearing for the first time. I'd heard, okay, there's this car accident story. I didn't know that there was this kind of broken-hearted heartbreak after a relationship that led into that car accident. So I remember hearing this for the first time, and I remember it being this kind of heavy feeling in the room of like, oh my God, that's awful, like high school sweetheart, and then you've both moved away together, and you think like, this is it, this is the life, this, you know, you're going to go on to get married and live the rest of your lives together. And then there's this moment, and I remember it feeling like really sad and this heaviness, and like it's like a pin could drop. This, it doesn't seem to have the same impact. And I think Brendon's doing the right thing in terms of the delivery, building up the dramatic tension, but maybe just the facial expressions there, or the audience just haven't quite grasped the shift of the emotion. So I don't think he's really going for the laugh here, which is a little bit unfortunate. But in terms of how he's built up that dramatic tension, beer, other boys, same night, and she cheated. So we get this very quick slide into the first struggle and challenge of this narrative story. So perhaps quite not the response he was necessarily looking for or would have necessarily been best in this moment. But you know what? Sometimes that happens in a speech. Sometimes you plan to have a response and you get a different response. You tell a joke and you think it's going to get a laugh and it doesn't get a laugh. You say something that's supposed to be serious and it gets a laugh. Sometimes that's just the way it happens with a speech. But what we're seeing there is a technique of how to build up the dramatic tension before there's the first struggle climax of this story.
Even operate in life anymore. I mean, here I'm this college, I didn't get out of bed. I stopped going to class. I barely ate anything, certainly nothing healthy. I stopped studying. I just stopped caring about the world. I know none of these 5 things are unique to college freshmen, so I'm getting there. Don't worry.
So here we see a little bit of a breaking of the tension. Because now Brendon has really built into this sad story. His girlfriend has cheated on him and he's getting into this state of depression, lethargy. He's not doing anything. He's disengaging from life. And so we've started to go into this very deep, somber part of the story. And you can't stay in that type of emotion for a long time. You've got to bounce and wave through a narrative. And so what Brendon understands here is, I need to show people that darkness and struggle. But if you stay here forever, you bring the audience right down and it's hard to bring them right out of it again. So he has a little bit of dramatic tension just being broken there, a little bit of a joke. It has a little lift. And this is a key to an effective emotional journey that you're taking your audience through, is you have the peaks and valleys. And even when you go right into a valley, still have these little peaks. Just take people out of it for a moment and then you can go back into it again. If you just flatline and you go dark, 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 it then does get really difficult for the audience to stay with you and hold that attention. So these little moments of just breaking the attention, not making light of things, not trivializing things, but having these appropriate moments of lift will help to keep your audience more engaged and allow them to actually feel the emotions more effectively. Because if you just flatline in dark, 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 it all starts to feel a bit samey to the audience. Let's say you watch one charity trailer. You watch that charity trailer and you go, oh man, that's really sad, that's awful. By the time you've seen the trailer 100 times or you've seen 100 different trailers, you start to desensitize to it a little bit, don't you? So you don't want your audience to get desensitized to the emotions of your story. And the way you stop that desensitization is to have this emotional variance going through your speech. And that's what we see here, for that little dramatic breaking of the tension.
And I happened to pick up the school newspaper and I opened it up and there was this full-page ad, and that ad changed my life. I never really got it until years later.
Great visual gestures here. Open up the paper. You can see that broadsheet, can you? It's not a tabloid he's reading, it's a broadsheet. So he opens up the paper and there's this big full page ad. Not this little banner ad in the corner, big full page ad. So what we're seeing here is a great example of demonstrative gestures. You're using gestures to help the audience visualize something. For example, one day, what am I doing? I'm driving my car, aren't I? So when you use these gestures, it helps the audience to see the story. You want to make your stories as visual as possible because that's what engages people. Look at TV shows and films. They visualize the story, don't they? When you read a fantastic book, the description is so keen. You see the characters. You see these places that don't exist. You're reading about Middle-earth or Hogwarts or whatever. You see that in your mind's eye, don't you? Because the author, the storyteller, has helped you to visualize what's going on. And that's what we need to do as storytellers on stage, is we need to create that visual impression on our audience. We want them to see what we saw, to see the story as it's playing out. And these types of demonstrative gestures allow the audience to get that visual influence and pull them into the story you're telling.
And across the top of the ad, it said, escape. Best headline ever, right? Escape.
Such good execution of this. You've got the broad gesture, the expression, and then the delivery of the line. And then the line is the punchline. But it's how it all ties together. If Brenda just said there was this word across the top, escape, it wouldn't have the same reaction. It wouldn't be getting a laugh from the audience. But when he goes, escape, and then holding that reaction, and that's where the laugh comes. And that's a sign of a good comedian, but let's face it, we're not comedians as speakers. We wannabe comedians as speakers. A good speaker who knows how to get a laugh, knows how to create the space for the laugh. He doesn't go, escape! He goes, escape. And into that pause comes the audience response and comes the audience laugh. So a really great execution all around there. The verbals, the non-verbals, and holding that space to create the audience interaction.
Students needed for summertime jobs in the Dominican Republic. Oh, yeah. I didn't know where the Dominican Republic was. I'm from Montana. But
Great bit of self-deprecating humor here. And here we're starting to see this emotional shift. So we went down and heavy. We're talking about the breakup. We're talking about this lethargy. We're talking about this depression. And then we get this uplift. There's the ad. There's the escape. There's a, well, I don't know what that is. I'm from Montana. So do you see how there's all this uplifting emotion coming in? We're starting to see this narrative journey of going into heaviness and this uplift again, this kind of hope, this optimism. And this isn't the first time we'll see this during the speech. You'll see these dips and rises, dips and rises. So Brendon is stacking a couple of different techniques on here to bring the story back up, to bring it all uplifting. As I said, you can't flatline. You can't flatline high and positive. It gets really irritating. You can't flatline low and negative because it gets really difficult and hard to deal with. You've got to have that variance coming in. So this little bit of self-deprecating humor, that's another nice way of bringing up the uplift. It creates relatability as well. We relate to someone who can take themselves off a pedestal a little bit. So a really nice injection of humor, just coming in at the right time as we're starting to hear that uplift in the story.
the entire thing, because all the windows were open, and that air was coming in. That amazing humid, if you've been in the Caribbean, that just gorgeous, amazing humid air is coming in. And just this life and this vibrancy felt like I was in the car. And we're driving down the road, 85 miles an hour on the road. On the radio is playing Tom Cochran's Life is a Highway. And we're singing this song at the top, Life is a Highway. We're just singing this thing.
This is some great sensory immersion, pulling us as the audience into the story. Good storytellers tell you a story. Great storytellers bring you into the story. Did you feel that warm Caribbean air hitting your face? Did you hear the crackly radio playing the high intensity music? Yeah, right? This is the power of sensory immersion. Brendon taps into two senses here. He talks about the feeling of the air and the wind, and he talks about the sound of the music and also him and his friends sing along in the car. When you tap into senses in these ways, that's what brings your audience into the story. Instead of Brendon saying, we were driving in the car, listening to music, and it was very hot. He's describing the same thing, but we don't see it in the same way. We don't feel it in the same way. And that's where the power of including senses in your story comes in. If you want to be a great storyteller and pull your audiences into the story, think about where you can activate those senses, how you can make them see what you saw, heard what you heard, felt what you felt, smelt and tasted what you smelt and tasted. You only need to include a couple. So Brendon's not talking about, yeah, so we're sitting there, we're eating some potato chips, and I can smell some plantain, and I see the cool Caribbean Ocean. So he doesn't need to use all of them. There's just a couple that pinpoints, and it pulls us right into that scene.
It had one of those signs. Watch out, sharp corner. You big U-turn shaped sign, 15 miles an hour, be careful, sharp corner ahead, slow down. New road, part of the country, undeveloped. We take that corner 85 miles an hour, and that corner became the turning point that put my feet on this stage for you today.
Great metaphor. Whenever you're telling a story, you're thinking about what is the message that people take away from this. Now, do you remember I said earlier that connecting with someone through your origin story, it's not about them having the same details of the story. So we're not sitting there going, well, I haven't been in a car crash, so this story doesn't relate to me. Because it's not about the car crash. It's not about the details of the story. It's about the essence of the story. The essence of this story is experiencing a turning point in life. And that is the metaphor that Brendon is using to connect his story to the audience's story. When I sat there in Brendon's seminar, I was at a turning point in my life. I had just graduated from university. My dad had just died, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I had just started dating the woman who would ultimately become my wife. So I was at this turning point in my life of the person I was and the person that I was going to become. And of course, the person I was going to become was not set in stone. There were different paths that I could take. But those three things coming together were a turning point in my life, particularly the last two, Dad and my wife, were this huge turning point. If they hadn't happened, I wouldn't be a public speaker. I wouldn't be a speaking coach. I wouldn't be recording this video for you right now if it hadn't been for that turning point in my life. My turning point was not a literal corner in a car accident. My turning point was one special person leaving my life, another special person coming into my life. When Brendon tells this story, the audience think about their turning point. That is the metaphor, that is the essence that brings people into the story, and that's where you connect. When you're telling your story, it's not about people having the same details of the story as you. It's about people having the same essence of the story as you. And how do you capture that essence? What's the metaphor? What's the message? What's the relatability? What's the commonality that people will connect to through your story? Brendon's identified it in his story. Have you identified it in yours?
Go around that corner. Kevin grabs the wheel. He goes, hold on.
Oh, a great facial expression. You're going to miss it because my video has unfortunately just covered Brendon's face here. Let's see. Does he do it again on camera?
And I remember this fear.
No, he doesn't. So I always include the link to the original footage in the video description below, and I always recommend you go and watch the talk that we're analyzing before that you then go and watch the analysis, because then you have the context for what we're talking about. So Brendon at this point, he does a great facial expression. His friend Kevin pulls the wheel and he goes, and there's just this essence of fear and tension in the whole dynamic, the facial expression, the posture, the tension. Is this great expression and demonstration of the fear that his friend is feeling. It's just, and he doesn't have to say anything. He doesn't say, my friend Kevin was really scared. All he has to do is, and we feel the fear come through. That's where we say it's not about telling your audience, it's about showing your audience. And that's a great example of showing and not telling.
This terror shoot through me. I can see the headlights. We're not going to make this corner. I can see the jungle. We're going to go off this road. Hold on. And I brace.
What Brendon has done now is he's moved his story into present tense. For a lot of the story up until now, he's been telling it in past tense. I went to college, she cheated. But now we're getting to the key drama of the story. The key drama of the story is not the breakup in college. That is the setting to help us understand this moment. But this is the key drama of the car accident. And to increase the drama and tension, Brendon switches into present tense. And when you're telling in present tense, it pulls the audience into that moment. So we're seeing a lot of different techniques stacking on top of each other. We're talking about that sensory description pulling the audience in. We're talking about that very kind of evocative and demonstrative body language, the fear on Kevin's face, the telling in the present tense. Telling in the present tense makes it feel like it's happening now, not something that's happened before. And here's the thing with present tense. The present is uncertain. The past has already happened and we know what the outcome is. So if you say, I was in a car accident, well, we know that you survived because you're telling us you were in a car accident, but you're here on the other side, right? But when you're talking about a car accident in present tense, it creates this illusion that we don't yet know what's going to happen. Now, of course we do because the person's on stage telling us, but it tricks our mind a little bit. It makes it feel like that is still an uncertain outcome. We don't know what's going to happen. It increases the tension. Now, present tense is not something that you use throughout your storytelling because, of course, when you underline everything, you underline nothing. But when you get to the key critical part of your story, when the attention and the emotion needs to be highest, that's when you switch into present tense. And Brendon does a great job of identifying this is the time to move into that. We've set up the scene by telling in past tense. Now we go into present tense to up the tension and up the emotion.
I felt the car sliding sideways. Kevin's gripping the wheel, trying to make the corner, and all of a sudden, smack! We hit this little...
Did you see a car around Brendon then? That little gesture of smack, you can almost see like Brendon in his imaginary seat at that moment, and the side of the car as the head goes smack. You start to see the car around him, don't you? And this is another great example of that type of immersive gesture. Instead of saying, I was sitting in the car and I smacked my head. Instead, we're in the car, turn in the corner, smack my head. It's so much more evocative and engaging, isn't it? And this is what I'm talking about how you demonstrate things in your story, is making your audience see the story playing out, not as if they're being told about it, but as if they are actually involved in it. So that's another great example there where I'm almost starting to see the squiggly outline around Brendon. I've got the car, I've got the headrest behind him, and I've got the side of the door dunting him in the head as they turn around this corner at high speed.
From beginning to end, the little you growing up to the bigger, better looking you. No, I didn't see that.
So again, we see this little bit of relieving tension. We've gone back into sort of this deep, heavy stuff. We're at the existential crisis of this car accident, of thinking about your life. And so what Brendon does there is just this small uplift. It's not completely yanking out of this heavier stuff. It's just making sure we don't get flatlined in the deep, heavy stuff for too long. So talking about this life journey, and then just the little, again, it's some non-verbal humor. It's just this little bit of an emotional uplift, a small giggle that just breaks that tension slightly, because we're now talking about existential, what is the meaning of life stuff. And that can get heavy and deep very quickly. So just recognizing there's a small opportunity to create an uptick in that, and that holds the audience's attention for longer. When the audience laugh, they listen. If you create a laugh right before something important that you've got to say, the audience are more likely to remember it because you've created this emotional response to them. You've spiked their attention with the laugh, and that means that what comes next, they've got this increased emotional response, this heightened attention. And that makes it more likely they're going to remember the important thing you say after the laugh. And the important thing that Brendon has to say here, he gets the laugh and then he says, did you live your life? Did you live your life the way you wanted to? And that's what he wants people to remember. And he's given them an improved chance of memorizing and taking on board that advice through creating that small laugh and breaking that emotional tension just a little bit.
There's little Brendon with his sister Helen swinging on the backyard swing set with that one pole that keeps coming out.
See that swinging gesture? Do you start to see his sister in the swing, the one pole coming out? Again, it's all about that immersive gestures. It's understanding how we use our body to help people visualize what you're talking about. Swinging on the swing, swinging on the swing. So we're really seeing a masterclass from Brendon here in terms of how to make his story visual, how to help the audience see what he's seeing, how to pull the audience into that story. And there's all these great examples of these demonstrative gestures, these visualizations of what he's talking about. And that's something that we can take into our speeches. Instead of just describing what you're talking about, I saw my sister swinging on a swing. Tell us, my sister swinging on a swing. And that will make it more powerful, more immersive, and leave a deeper impact on your audiences.
When you're surrounded by people that you love, and it makes you wonder, did I love?
You see that heart gesture again? We're now moving into a part of the story talking about love. And Brendon wants to make sure we really feel and sense that emotion. What does he do? Anchors us back into love. When did we last see the double heart gesture? Talking about the love of the high school sweetheart. Now he wants to talk about love again, and he anchors love with the double heart gesture again. So he's using what's come before. He was able to anchor love into this gesture earlier on, talking about love. When he wants to drop the audience back into that emotion again, we've got another heart gesture. So it's such a simple thing to do. And sometimes I'll have speakers who say, I feel it's difficult communicating emotion, or I feel that my audience don't experience the emotion the way that I'm experiencing it. This is a little hack that you can do where you actually drop into the emotion more yourself when you do this. It's like an anchor and a trigger for you. And it's also an anchor and a trigger for the audience as well. Really simple technique, really nicely executed in this speech.
Did I love? No, I shut out everybody. We all do that. You get hurt, and now you want to be more buttoned up after you get hurt.
What we see here is Brendon relating this part of the speech to the audience. I shut people out. We all do that. Whenever you tell a story, and especially when it's your personal story, the story isn't about you. It's about your audience. You don't tell a personal story so that the audience get a deep idea of who you are. You tell a personal story so the audience get a deep idea of who they are. And that's a tricky mind shift that we have to make. When we're telling our personal story, yes, there's an element of the audience relate to us a little bit more, we develop a rapport, we ultimately establish some credibility and authority through it. But what you really want from a story is you want the audience to have these me too moments. That's me. I feel like they are speaking just to me right now. You've got to think about where you pull your audience into your story. And little things like that, of these little we statements or you statements, just bring the audience in at that moment and help them to see how they relate to this story, where they fit into this story, and what they can take from this story. So even when a story is about you, it's really about them.
Not putting yourself out there because you got hurt one time. So you put on the mask, you put on the facade, you build the walls, whatever the metaphor is for you, but you know it is. If you build the walls to keep out the bad guys, who else can't get in? the good guys.
Rhetorical question. You build the walls, who else can get in? The good guys. So again, we're starting to see Brendon shifting into a bit more of an interactive nature with the story. He's highlighted the events and the details of a lot of the story. Now he's starting to pull the audience in more. And something like a rhetorical question. So he doesn't actually get the audience to say out loud, who is it? There's just that moment of thinking. There's that moment where the audience engages with that part of the story. Who else can't get in? Oh, well, the good guys. Have I been doing that? That's the purpose of that rhetorical question. It's getting the audience to think about that. Rather than Brendon just saying, when I built my walls, the good guys couldn't get in. Well, then that's about him, but the audience don't see themselves in it. But by just changing that slightly, he's saying essentially the same thing, but by changing the delivery of it, well, now the audience start thinking about how that applies to them as well. And that's the secret to a great story, is you've got to have the audience thinking about how does that apply to them as well? Because then that gives them the learning opportunity from the story. If you tell a fantastic, entertaining, engaging story, but the audience don't take anything away from it, well, that is not a good story. A good story is entertaining, engaging, and educational at the same time.
When I came to, I looked over, and Kevin is screaming at the top of his lungs, "Get out of the car, Brendon, get out of the car!" And I look over.
Another way that you create that present tense narrative and build that tension is have dialogue. So instead of saying, we'd crashed and Kevin was telling me to get out of the car, you actually have Kevin in that scene saying the words, "Brendon, get out of the car." So this dialogue, again, we wouldn't use dialogue through every single part of a story, because when you underline everything, you underline nothing. But when you want these key dramatic moments, that's the time to introduce character dialogue. So again, we feel like we're there listening to these characters talking. It's not, yeah, so Brendon was in a car crash and his friend was saying this to him. It's like, no, we're there on the scene and we're hearing the words, we're seeing what's going on, we're sensing everything with that description, with the air, the sound, the hitting on the head, all of that. We're there in that moment. And let's see another addition that Brendon does to the dialogue here.
And a whole big chunk of his head is open. There's blood everywhere. His eyes are wild. Get out of the car, get out of the car. And I'm scared.
So do you see there's now that tone change of get out of the car, get out of the car. There's this emotional ramping up. So not only is he doing the dialogue, he's thinking about, well, how do I create that same emotion of it instead of Brendon, get out the car. Now, of course, nobody would do it like that. But the first time it's Brendon, get out of the car. And then it's Brendon, get out of the car. So you hear this tone, there's this tension. So all of this narrative tension is building. There's been this car accident. We're telling it in the present tense. We're hearing the characters speaking the dialogue. And all of that makes it feel like we are there in that moment. So this is another really powerful tool for pulling your audience in, creating that dramatic tension. Again, don't do it through all of the parts of your story, but when you need those key moments of drama, when you need those key moments of learning a lesson or hearing a message, that's when you can have it delivered through dialogue like Brendon's doing in this scene.
And I saw the blood going off the hood of the car. And just as I was about to pass out, I noticed a glint, like a sparkle, something shiny, a reflection in the blood going off the hood of the car, and it made me look up.
We almost see this playing out of real-time thought. We don't go to, I saw a reflection. It's like we're there and Brendon, he's about to pass out. Is that a glint? A sparkle? No, it's a reflection. Where's the reflection coming from? It's like we're there in that moment going through the thought process. It's a simple thing. And it almost looks like in the moment, he doesn't know what word he wants to say, but that's not actually what's happening. He's replaying his thought process where when he was in that scenario and he's all woozy and shaken up, he doesn't know what it is to begin with. So again, it's just this another really nice detail, this immersive detail where this is what it was like in real time for him. And as he describes it with this real-time sensation, using all the different techniques that we have talked about up until now, that is bringing us into the story as well and making it feel like it's playing out in real time for us too.
And there was this bright, big, beautiful moon that night. I hadn't even seen it earlier. This moon so big that the blueness was emanating across the whole sky.
Lovely use of language there, emanating. And you can see that blueness and the nice little gesture that goes along with it as well. Really nice word choice there. A lot of the time we want to think about making our language simple and clear, but I always think that there's room for advanced use of language, and sometimes these advanced words, they have these specific uses, and instead of this blue light was shining or glowing, emanating, it's just this all-encompassing feel. It's a much more powerful word, and it's such an appropriate use of it here. Absolutely love it.
Like I knew I was going to be okay. From this moment of fear, just this immediate moment of...
I really like the anchoring of motions here. So Brendon has this contrast. Whenever he looks up, there's this hope, optimism, and then looking down is anchoring fear. So all the car accident has happened here where he's crawling out the car, there's blood, but in the blood he sees the glint and the reflection, and when he looks up from the glint and reflection, he gets that hope. And then he looks back down at the moment of fear, but he's got the moment of hope. So it's this really nice anchoring of emotions that we feel the fear here and we feel the hope here. And all he has to do is move between those places to get us to feel those emotions as well. So this is a really effective technique of when you've been building your story, you can anchor the emotions in different parts of the stage, with different gestures, with different voices, with different stances. There's lots of different ways you can anchor that emotion. And once you've built into it, all you have to do is move to that part of the stage, use that tone of voice, have that particular gesture or stance, and the audience will be transported back into that emotion. When you've done the hard work of establishing and generating the emotion for them, then you can do the easy work of anchoring it for them again when you need them to drop back into that place.
Connection. I felt like I was going to be okay. And I felt like the big guy upstairs reached down to me and handed me life's golden ticket.
Here we have another metaphor, life's golden ticket. So, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the golden ticket. The golden ticket is that chance, is that opportunity. And that's what Brendon is using this story to demonstrate. The next message of this story is one of opportunity. It's how are you going to take your opportunity? After your turning point in life, whatever that might be, how are you going to take life's golden ticket, your opportunity? And again, this is how that story then expands into this universal message of my details of the story were car accident, survived, got these questions about my life. For me, sitting there, my turning point, my dad dying, my opportunity, becoming a speaker. The details of the story are different, but the essence of the story is the same. And you create that essence, you build that universal message through this use of metaphor. Talking about a turning point, being given life's golden ticket. How do you work these into your story? How do you encapsulate the message and essence of your story? So Brendon has used these great metaphors to pull out what is the lesson that comes from this. What is the common lesson that people will connect to in this part of the story? They might not have experienced the details of the story, but they will have felt the essence of the story. And that's what life's golden ticket is doing here. We're not talking about, so we're all going to own a chocolate factory one day. We're talking about what is that golden opportunity to take your life in a new direction after experiencing that turning point.
I will earn this.
Fantastic delivery of the line. I will earn this. That inflection on that key word of earn. I will earn this. I will pay this back. I will make the most of this opportunity. And then just holding that space, holding that gesture. You won't see it because my stupid face, it's blocking Brendon's face. But you'll see the expression as well of, I will earn this. Just fantastic textbook delivery of that line. Really feeling the power and importance of that line through the vocal inflection, holding the gesture, holding the expression, and holding the space, and allowing the magnitude of that line to settle with the audience.
I knew that time was limited. Mortality, motivation. Mortality, motivation. I got it as a 19-year-old kid.
Alliterative slogan, mortality, motivation. Alliteration, it helps make a statement more memorable. So now we've got this other catchy slogan coming in. We've got the turning point, we've got life's golden ticket, we've got mortality, motivation. What Brendon is trying to do is pull all of the story's key ideas into a few memorable phrases. And these memorable phrases are the ones that are going to stick. We might not remember all the different details. Where did he go to college? What island in the Caribbean were they in again? Those aren't the details that matter. What matters is about having a turning point in your life, taking life's golden ticket, and having that mortality motivation driving you along, recognizing that you have a limited amount of time to make the most of that opportunity. So we're using the alliteration here, another technique to try and make sure these are the key ideas that will stick with the audience.
Now, don't worry, Kevin and I, we both survived. See, I'm still here. It's okay. I made it through. Kevin made it through. We made it.
What we see now is relieving the tension. Brendon doesn't need the story to be tense anymore. We don't need to be in that suspense. Oh my God, what's going to happen? We're now ready to come out of that. And so what he does to relieve the tension is go, look, like, I know we were just in a car accident. I know I was losing consciousness and there was blood all over the place. But hey, look, I'm here and I'm telling the story. Kevin was fine as well. So we're now ready to come out of that part of the story, come out of the tension and start going into that uplifting message at the end. So Brendon recognizes here that now is that moment to start relieving the tension, start calming out of that and moving into that final uplifting message that the audience can take from this whole story.
How many of you, I'm curious, in a room like this, how many of you, by raise of hands, how many of you feel like you've gotten at some point in your life a second chance? Raise your hand and say, that's me. That's me. If you feel...
What we see here is Brendon specifying the interaction that he wants. And sometimes you have to do this more than once. If you tell your audience, who here feels like they've had a second chance? Oh, yeah, yeah, raise your hands. Yeah, oh, yeah, shout out. So when you want interaction from your audience, make it really clear. Number one, if you want it. If you're asking just a rhetorical question, just leave it with them and move on. But when you're wanting that interaction, tell them, raise a hand. You notice Brendon says that twice? By a raise of hands, who's felt this? Raise your hand and say, I'm here. He actually says it twice. So he makes it really clear, this is what I want you to do. This is how I want you to interact. And then he adds that extra. So he's got them to raise their hands. And as they're raising their hands, shout, I'm here as well. Whenever you're wanting that interaction, you've got to be crystal clear because people get very passive and they get into listener mode. When you're wanting them to be active and engaging, make it really clear that you do want them to interact and engage. This isn't rhetorical. And tell them how you want them to interact and engage.
What a blessing that is you got that life. What a blessing is you got that breath. What a blessing. Because that means you still got time.
You. We're now seeing the story really shift from that I focus of this was me in the story, this is what I learned, this is what's happening, and now we're really starting to see that transfer to you. Okay, right, so what are you going to take from this story? Where's the lesson for you? How does this story impact and change you? What are you going to take from this? So that switch in the pronouns of when you're telling a personal story, you are trying to involve the audience with you and us, but there is going to be a lot of I talk in there. But transitioning out that story, you've got to get a lot more into you, a lot more into us. You. So showing the audience, this is now your time to take what you need from the story.
You got to work for it. You got to contribute for it. You got to give for it. You got to lead for it. You got to love for it because you...
Do you see that? You've gotta. We've got this rule of three, and it's not just a verbal rule of three. We've also got the movement rule of three. You've got. So this is now hammering home the lessons of the speech in there. This is what I want you to take away. You've got to do this. You've got to do this. You've got to do this. The story has 3 lessons throughout it, and now Brendon is emphasizing this is how you put those lessons into play. And you hear, it's all you statements now, isn't it? It's not, this is what I realized and what I needed to do. This is what you got to do, you got to do, you got to do. So really starting to hammer home how the audience is going to take something from the story he's just told.
Because guess what? I go back to college. Remember the depressed, sad Brendon who can't get out of school, or can't get out of bed, can't go to class.
Do you see how when Brendon wants to take us back to college, he takes us all the way back to the audience's left? This is stage anchoring. So I've talked about anchoring on other videos before, so really brief. You can establish a timeline on stage of past, moving into the present and future. You can establish emotional journey of struggle and challenge into success and aspiration. So Brendon takes us back in the past on the timeline, past into future. He also takes us back into the negativity. So going back to college, it's all here. Remember I was talking about anchoring earlier on? He now takes us back to that anchored moment, and we start to feel that feeling again. As soon as he's back at college and he's standing here, we feel that depression, we feel that despondency of what he was talking about before.
My demarcation line was, I am not going to fail to live, love, and matter anymore. I'm not going to be that old Brendon. I'm going to be this person, this more intentional, loving.
You see this anchoring again? During the demarcation line, I'm not going to be all of these negative things pointing back towards the audience's left on the stage. I'm going to be all of these things. So I'm not going to be the negative stuff in the past. I'm going to be this aspirational stuff of the future. And he's using the gestures to convey positive and negative. He's using those gestures to anchor those key emotions, because through telling his story, he's already created those emotional anchors. He's telling us where we don't want to be and where we want to be instead.
All of my friends from year 1, oh my God, guess what they did? Same thing people do to you when you go home on Monday. What happens when you change and the other people around you don't go through the same experience? Who's ever had that before? You...
Now bringing in this relatable moment of when you have that tall poppy syndrome around you, when you have the cynicism, when you've got a different perspective on your life that people around you haven't necessarily got. So he's now talking about this relatable moment. And there's a little bit of the painting of the road going on here of this is what the road to change looks like. And this is what great leaders do. Great leaders, they tell you about the vision. We're going to the Emerald City. Here's the yellow brick road. But they also tell you about the wicked witch you're going to encounter. They talk about the challenges that you're going to encounter on that yellow brick road. And that's what Brendon's doing here. He's relating this of, okay, you're going to come to this event and maybe you feel inspired, maybe you want to change. You've had that turning point, you're seizing that opportunity, but that doesn't mean the journey is finished. The journey is still tough, and here's some of that toughness that you'll experience along that journey. This is a really key part of leadership, and this is something that a lot of speakers leave out, is they will tell you about, oh, here's how things were bad, here's how things improved for me, or here's how things are bad for you right now, but here's how things can be better. but they don't paint the path. They don't guide you along the way. And that's what great leaders do. Great leaders take you down that path. They don't just go, there's the path, walk along it, you'll be fine. They help you to understand what the journey is going to be like. So we've got this relatable moment connecting with the audience, and also this moment of leadership of telling them, here's some of the struggles and challenges you encounter along the way.
Everybody, what do they say to you when you start living your life more on full? What do they say? You live in full now. What do they say to you? Yeah, what's wrong with you?
So now we're getting vocal interaction. What do they say? What do they say? What do they say? So again, Brendon hammers home, I want you to tell me, what do they say? It's not just, what do they say, rhetorical. It's not, what do they say, here's some examples, I'll write something down. It's, what do they say? What do they, and you notice there's a little bit of a gesture, there's this kind of geeing on of the audience. I want you to vocally interact here. So again, we're seeing how Brendon is communicating to the audience. How would I want you to interact into this moment? How would I want to bring you into this part of the speech? So always be clear with your audience. And when you want your audience to interact, don't half-heart it. You didn't see Brendon go, well, what do they say? He goes, what do they say? What do they say? What do they say? He really G's the audience out and goes, I want you to vocalize what do they say in this moment. You can see through Brendon's example the power of having a signature story. The way it communicates lessons, how it builds relatability of the audience, how it establishes yourself as a leader and an authority, and how it makes an impact on people's lives. I watched this story being told for the first time by Brendon in 2016. Nearly a decade later, it still has an impact on me. That's the power that you can have as a speaker as well. And if you feel that you need help with developing a signature story or even finding out what your signature story is in the first place, that's where I can help you as a public speaking coach. We'll look at the story that you have already or the story that you think you might have already and identify, well, what's really working about it? What are those powerful lessons that we can extract from it? How are you building that relatability for the audience? Where does it establish yourself as an authority, as a leader? We'll look at all those good bits and then think about, well, how can we sharpen those up going forward? And that's what I'm going to do with Brendon's video in just a moment. If you'd like help with your story in a similar way, I've put a link to my LinkedIn in the video description below. If you just connect with me there, reach out in a message and say what you're working on with your signature story right now, how you think it could be made better or where you're finding challenges with it right now, and we'll look at different couple coaching options and find out what's the best option that works for you. Now, let's return to Brendon's story and look at where he, even with his great inspirational story that has totally impacted me, how could he continue to improve and hone it going forward?
Life aligned in this passionate love affair in high school. Have you ever had that high school just like complete dreaming, oh my God?
We rushed through that have you ever question. Some advice that I heard a long time ago in speaking is don't ask a question you don't want your audience to answer. And what we see there is that's a question that Brendon didn't really want the audience to answer. And by answer, we don't mean like a vocal answer. It's okay if the question is rhetorical, but you've got to give the audience the opportunity to answer that rhetorical question for themselves. And Brendon just rushes through, have you ever had that relationship, blah, blah, blah. So the audience don't have that moment of time to think about when were they in a similar situation in a relationship, to see themselves. So it's this small lost opportunity for connection there where Brendon's trying to invite the audience in to connect with where have they felt a similar relationship, but he rushes through that invitation, doesn't give enough time for the audience to come in and feel a part of this story about a relationship.
And other boys on the same night, and she cheated. And if you've ever been in a relationship where everything of you was...
So I think Brendon meant to hold that pause of she cheated and let that moment sink in. But I actually wonder, when the audience laughed at the build up to that, remember we talked about that build up earlier of beers, other boys on the same night. I don't think he was expecting that laugh. And I think it threw him off that cheated line a little bit. And I think he meant to hold that. And he recognized that the emotion hadn't quite built up in the right way. And he interrupted himself with that. And he realized then that he actually hadn't meant to speak at that point. And he had to recompose himself and collect himself. So I think that was just a moment where Brendon got thrown off a little bit by the audience interaction. And I would have said, just go with what you meant to go with, of holding that moment, and people will shift emotions, and they'll realize you weren't trying to be funny. They'll realize that you're leading into that tough moment of being cheated on and being heartbroken. So Brendon he interrupted his emotional moment a little bit there, and it yanked the audience back out. The audience could have been brought into that emotion with that good pause and that good expression, but just the little interruption, it pulled them back out, and it means he has to readjust for the next part of the speech.
But the problem was I literally couldn't get out of bed. My friends would come and, Brendon, come on, they'd motivate me, you know? Some friends would drop by and they'd...
Brendon uses this tick of quite a lot. And is one of these things, if you've ever been to Toastmasters, it's on the list of bad filler words and phrases you should use. And it's not that you should never ever use them or your speech is ruined if you use them every now and then. It is one that I see Brendon use quite a lot. He does use this quite a lot. Well, we either don't know and we're wanting you to teach us, or we do know and we don't need you to tell us that we know. And sometimes, it's not related to anything that's intellectual or rational. It's just, it's interrupting a space of pause and silence. So this is a tick that Brendon uses quite a lot. And again, it doesn't ruin the speeches by them being in there, but it's not an efficient use of words he could be saying instead, or even just allowing that silence to set in, of making an impactful point and having some silence for that point to sink in before moving on to the next one, rather than having a little, just interrupting that space. It's a little bit like what we saw in that previous example I was talking about, of Brendon had that silence and he interrupted the silence, and it just it broke that moment a little bit. And these can similarly break those moments after a good impactful line has been delivered. Just presenting some silence and some space for the audience to digest what's been said before.
Or where my turning point was. And I didn't know if it was in the moment that I figured all this out, or if it was in weeks and months later of going through and processing what had happened to me. But I'm very clear about what happened now. Because when you brace at the end...
I think here Brendon breaks out of his story, and I think he breaks out of it unnecessarily. He's in this dramatic, tense moment. They're hitting the corner and brace. And then he goes into this quite logical space of, well, I don't know if I worked it out. And he breaks the timeline here. He's built up all this present tense tension. So remember we talked about that earlier with the present tense, with the senses, with the dialogue. He's done this great job of bringing the audience into the moment. And then we get yanked back out of it for this kind of logical musing. And then he goes back into the moment. And I think it's not necessary at this time. Tell us the story, bring us into that moment, and then we can have the reflection later. We can move into that headspace at a more appropriate time. Here we've moved into this emotional place and we get yanked into our heads, and then he's got to drop us back into our hearts again. So I think that bit could have just been left out entirely. Stay in the moment, stay in the tension, stay in the drama.
So you can live intentionally, live with purpose. You can't live with intention and purpose if you don't even know how you're going to evaluate your life at the end.
See where he's pointing? Do you remember we were talking about stage anchoring earlier? And I was saying that Brendon has some great examples of taking us into the past, back into the future, the negative, the positive. But when he points at the end, he points down the timeline into the past. He's not pointing to the end of the timeline. So this was just an odd bit of getting the stage directions wrong, which surprised me because I know that Brendon is someone who's intentional about how he's using the stage and how he's anchoring things, because I'm seeing enough good examples of him doing it elsewhere that I know he's not doing it accidentally. I know he's deliberately anchoring things on stage. So yeah, this was just an odd thing where he got his directions the wrong way around.
I hadn't lived. I'd been thinking about how to take my life, not live it. Because in the weeks and the months before I went on the trip, I'd become suicidal. And not just thinking about it, planning it. And
so this is where I think Brendon mixed up his story. And I pretty much know. And the reason why I know this is because I've heard a different version of this story. And I remember in the version that I heard, this notion of suicide, it gets introduced into the story earlier. When he's talking about his breakup and when he's talking about being at college, he's despondent, he can't get out of bed, he can't go to class. And it's at this moment that he starts talking about, I'm sitting there and I'm starting to think about suicide. I'm starting to think about if life is worth going on. And then he gets that moment of opening up the paper, seeing escape and just going, hey, you know, I need to get out of this place. I need to get out of this hole and try and find something. So this idea of suicide, it gets seeded earlier on. So when he starts talking about the first question being, did I live? He then makes a callback to that part of the story. And we get this link with how he was feeling in the place that he was in before this. So when I'm watching this, I basically know that he's got his storytelling mixed up and he forgot to say this in the previous part. But what means is that this suddenly gets thrust at us at this moment in the story. And it means that it doesn't make as much sense and it doesn't have much context of, oh, well, okay, well, we didn't realize how significant this was because we didn't know you were in this suicidal place. And I think Brendon, he realizes this on stage and he's starting to talk about, I've been thinking about taking my own life. And he realizes, oh, shit, I forgot to say this earlier. He says, in the moments leading up to going away, this is how I was feeling. But I think what he needs to do instead, when he recognizes that he didn't mention that before, don't bring it in this time. Because then you're throwing this like huge, big contextual element in, but it kind of feels like sprung upon us. We didn't see it coming because it hasn't had that context and setup before. So of course it's a really important part of the story and it links in with this first question. But I think if Brendon has forgotten to mention it before, he can just leave it out on this particular telling. Don't spring this heavy idea into the middle of something because it throws people off a little bit. You can still talk about the importance of living my life. He can talk about how, you know, mention something different. Say, I moved away to college based on who I was dating in high school. Was that a situation that I necessarily thought of myself, and that was that my decision to go away? So he could bring something else into talking about this question rather than throwing in this deep, heavy thing that hasn't had the groundwork set up earlier on in the story.
I'd become suicidal. And not just thinking about it, planning it. And I was already thinking.
Another tick that Brendon has, it's this hanging and. It's not an and joining two things together like I love peanut butter and jam. It's this hanging and of moving from one point and saying the next thing. That's a hanging and. That hanging and, it creates a little bit of a disjoint in the flow of your speech. It usually comes during storytelling. And the reason why I know it usually comes during storytelling, this is one of my ticks. It's one of the things that I've had to really work on in my storytelling, of being clear. It's okay to leave something, move on to the next part. You don't have to have this constant and this and this and this. And it can come in when you've lost your flow a little bit. There was maybe something that you're going to say and you've forgotten, and you kind of know that you've forgotten. You feel a little bit nervous in the moment. This hanging and, it comes in a lot of different places. And one of the things I'm still working on right now is being able to just move from one part of the story. Now, and of course has its place. When you're linking two ideas together, the title of this is the power of grace and intention. That's not a hanging and, that's an and that links things together, but it's this distorted and. The way to tell if you've got a hanging and, take the previous statement and the next statement. Would those things make sense by themselves? Most of the time that they will. And you'll hear the inflection on the and. It's not, we're going to do this and this. It's, this happened and the next thing happened. So again, this is just another little tick that comes up from time to time in Brendon's storytelling. And if we take that away, it creates this smoother flow and energy to the narrative.
A moment of either fear or inspiration or heartache or something shifts you.
Did you hear that? We had this lovely little rule of three we had of fear, heartache, inspiration, and something. We didn't need that and something. We had a lovely rule of three there, and Brendon could just left it at that rule of three. The rule of three is nice and concise, it's easy to remember, it's sticky with the audience, and then there was just kind of this dribbling on afterwards and something. And what? We didn't even get another adjective. We just got a and fill in the blanks here. So again, just a little bit of tightening up of the language here. We had a great rule of three, great speaking technique. We love threes as speakers. Just keep it as a three. And anytime you notice yourself on stage, sometimes you accidentally come out with rule of threes. You'll just start saying things. When you've said three things and they're all good things, just leave it and move on to the next thing. You don't have to come up with every single variation of what could possibly happen in that scenario. Just pick out three prominent ones to stick with the audience.
You know, I got so hurt, I hadn't felt my heart in months. You know, I hadn't felt anything.
Do you see the come in there? And again, there's this really poignant point of, I haven't felt my heart in months. And that's an opportunity for connection there. There's the pause, there's the heart gesture. That's something the audience will relate to, that there'll be people sitting in the audience, they haven't felt their heart in months. They've been shutting down to that love, to that connection. And that it doesn't need to be there. We don't need to say in order for us to know. People will feel that they know. They don't need to be questioned that you know. Do you see how you can take out that tick? And not only does it make sense by itself without the tick, it's also stronger without that as well. So there was this emotional moment building up, and again, it just got a little bit broken there with this logical, rational input of and sticking people in their heads when you want to be keeping them in their hearts.
Looking down, and he's screaming over here, and I look and I notice all this blood on me, and I feel like this shock and this terror going down. 19-year-old kid having his little mortality moment. Because I look down and I see that blood.
Again, I feel this was just an interjection we didn't need. A car accident with blood all over you, that's significant. It doesn't matter what age you are. So again, I feel this was just jerking us out of the tension and the drama of the moment. Just stay in that. We're there, there's the screaming, crawling out the car, there's blood. That scene, it makes sense regardless of how old the person experiencing it is. So again, I think it's another little interjection where it yanked us out the story, and I don't think we needed it. We didn't have the context. If you want to mention, and Brendon does do this, if you want to mention the significance of getting that moment at a younger age, sure thing, but mention it later on. Stay with the drama of the story and add that extra context and perspective later on when we are coming back out of the tension of that story. Don't yank us out of that key emotional moment.
And I realized it was because of how I'd been living my life, and I wasn't living to my questions. I knew I got those questions. Did I live? Did I love? Did I matter? And as soon as I got that those were...
So this was some really nice anchoring with the gestures here. Did I live? Did I love? Did I matter? So this is all good. The reason why I'm mentioning it here at this point in the video is I think Brendon could have built on this even more during the speech. So we've got these three questions that he ultimately wants to come to, and we're seeing a little bit of anchoring with the gestures there. I think he could have taken that a step further and been even more intentional about how he anchored those on stage. So he could have this idea of living. Did I live in one part of the stage? Did I love in the next part of the stage? Did I matter in this part of the stage? And that means when he wants to bring the audience to those questions, he's then got this extra anchor that he can draw upon. He's got the position on the stage, and he can use the gestures to refer to them. So he's got an inbuilt triad here. We love the rule of three in speaking. It's great. We're adding some anchoring with the gestures. And I think just adding the next layer on top of that, apart from that one exception that proves the rule, Brendon's demonstrating that he understands the anchoring and moving of the stage. He's utilizing it very effectively in some of the examples that we've seen. I think that was another example where he could have brought in to make this point even stronger and better.
Loving, connected, contributing person. And I went back to college on fire year two.
Don't do two that way. I don't know how many countries in the world that this is true, but doing your two the opposite way to that, it does not mean just two in every single country in the world. Do not do your twos like that on stage, because it can mean different things in different countries around the world. So just a simple thing, keep it safe. Palm two, not your fist two. And that's all I've got in terms of evaluating and analyzing and improving upon Brendon's speech already. This is a story that has hugely impacted and resonated with me. It's something that I've been really looking forward to going and analyzing. Once I made the decision to start doing more of these analysis videos and thinking about the different types of speeches that I could analyze, I was like, man, why don't I go to this speech? This is such a seminal story in my speaking career. It's one of these key seeds that got planted in my speaking journey. It wasn't the only seed that got planted, but this was when the seed started sprouting. I'd had the seeds leading up to then. I'd had the water and the fertilizer, and really extend this metaphor as much as you want. But when I went to Brendon's event, Experts Academy in California, April 2016, that is when that seed burst and it started to grow. And it all came, not just from hearing this story, but this was when I first heard this full story, and it was part of the whole package, the whole experience of that event changing my life. And that's the power we have as speakers. And that's why I wanted to become a speaker, because I experienced for myself the power that someone has to change someone's life just by standing on stage. And I knew if I had the opportunity to do that for someone else, then I had passed it forward and I'd paid it forward. I'd taken Brendon's example and how he had helped me, and I could take that example and move on to help someone else. And you have the ability to do that as a speaker as well. You have the ability to impact and change someone's life with your story, your voice, and your message. And what this analysis video highlights is how to make that story pop and stand out, and how to sharpen and hone your story so that you have the opportunity to make the maximum impact when you tell it on stage.